Hello everyone, today we talk about the evangelization of Eastern Frankish. Some of you have asked me more videos about the evangelization of Europe, not necessarily recently, but from time to time. There is definitely a swing in the content, like for a period, the cycle may propose us lots of concentrated videos about the same topic. Other times, like it literally happens across years. It's very strange. However, you know that not only we're getting there, but I have a specific playlist about the evangelization of Europe. This is an important chapter that blends with the video I already made with the Heliand. In fact, this is a follow-up, a comparison between that work that, as you know, tended very much to integrate, or at least to properly conjugate the traditional Catholic models brought by Christendom, the Franco-Roman tradition, and in fact properly the Norse Germanic, the old Saxon, as a matter of fact, in this case, ones in the same way. They actually overlapped, but were just had just been dealt doctrinally, ritually, and under many other aspects in different ways, so much that people today still believe that we're talking about Christianity versus paganism, whereas we're just looking at the same Catholic tradition before and after Christianity, essentially being molded, being blended in some cases from the springs of respective cultures at different stages of development, etc. In fact, that have nothing to do with that. Last year I made a video, for example, about the old Frisian religion, and we pointed out how some peoples, say even within, again, the same people, there was always essentially a Catholic base that corresponded to the elite, the establishment, that in fact, even though they were, in this case, especially like the most faithful like followers of Vodanism, for example, were not actually taken on by the Christians. But during the evangelization, this was the same elite that actually more smoothly was eventually evangelized for obvious reason, and an actual paganistic, so we're talking about that fractal telluric chthonic superstition that was always persecuted throughout all the millennia in the European tradition and beyond, because in fact it had nothing really to do with the system. And in any case, its cults, whenever they oppose, in fact, the evangelization and spread of a Catholic power that, like especially in this case, was reactivating on the basis of probably like the regrowth where in the 8th and the 19th century of Europe after the so-called Dark Ages, was in fact capable of controlling more population, more territory, etc. And that in fact was not even taken seriously in consideration like today. Like fourth estaters are the scum of the earth. They think stupid things. They are counter-cultural, counter-authority, whatever, but they do not have the factual power to do anything specific. So it's not that we're knocking at the door and gun them down, right? We basically just let them be. And at the time, this was the same with, generally speaking, the peasantry. If you look again at the spread of Christianity across Europe, mostly was a matter of central power, right? And the rest of the population simply accepted this, basically got into a syncresis, and the survival even of certain more superstitionistic, like materialistic, deterministic cults, etc., was basically tolerated, and basically literally nobody cared about this, as long as, of course, it did not entail some broader communitarian instance like it would happen, for example, under a Christian clothing during, for example, the 12th century, mostly the great heresies, Catholicism, Gnosticism, Manichaeism, the Bogomilists in the Balkans, etc. It's always the same type of ideas. The fact that different, let's say, Marxists would call it superstructures would change under different colors and names. It actually doesn't matter. It's always the same identical say clash between power and the absence of it. And so, of course, the Holy Ghost, respectively, the Holy Ghost and death, right? And again, as you know, I have an enormous amount of Indo-Europeistics, and also just basic history of religion, history of Christianity, medieval Christianity, ancient Christianity, etc. videos. So I've stopped making these premises explaining to people that literally what Catholicism means, and this still hasn't become a meme somewhere on the internet apparently, but in fact that's also because if you want to get it, fine, otherwise it's not my problem, right? I'm just speaking from my credentials, and I don't need even to convince you by force. So East Francia is a very important theater context here because, as you know, basically the Franks succeeded in doing what the Romans had left basically half done, that it was essentially the full colonization of Germany, right? And the full integration of this into the Catholic Empire, so much so that the same Saxons, paradoxically, would become the most zealous, faithful followers of this. There are many parallelisms also among other people, so sort of more primitive and warlike. Think about the Seljuks for Islam, for example. And but this has even a deeper meaning in the Roman tradition of the saint that the same Ottonians would give to this to the Germanic Empire. That was in fact the Roman one. Now, and I don't even have to explain to you that as well, so because I have a hefty Renovatio Imperii playlist, so this happens sometimes on a channel like mine. So I made an extensive amount of work. I say one thing, people listen for 10 minutes, they don't even understand the rest of the video because they don't literally watch it. But especially they have to say their own thing without knowing that I made literally entire days freely, watchable online about these very topics in great depth. It's just like going to a professor and saying, you're wrong because you said this, and this person has written like a plethora of books that not just are actually correct, but that the author of the question maybe literally mistakes as, it happens often to me. I say something, the person understands the opposite of it and accuses me of something it doesn't even understand, all right? Usually in these topics, it's really typical. Like I had, a guy, this always happens with the whiny Celtic fringe that, I talk about what I was talking about. I mean, I think Caesar's conquest of Britain, that I support mass migration into Europe because I literally state that, the Roman Empire steamrolled the Celts, in that situation. Like, isn't it more likely that anyone formulating this idea is just a lesser human being? Maybe, on an objective scale. I would check that, right? Because, I don't want that overwhelming load of migrants, but frankly would kick out some lesser people from here too, which would make things much more qualitative under every, moral, spiritual, biological, genetical point of view. In any case, it should not be forgotten that the epic religious path pursued by the author of the Heliand is in fact the same proof of what I'm talking about here. There are people who think, for example, that if I support Christianity, I am supporting some sort of, Judeo-Christian conspiracy at the detriment of the Indo-European purity of the race or things like that. Again, people still have problems with what I said before, that Catholicism always existed across before and after Christianity, that paganism literally did not exist, if not in that lesser form that had in fact nothing to do with what was especially addressed by the Heliand. And again, I made a specific video about that. If you don't get the references, it's not my fault if you're undereducated. I have literally no responsibility whatsoever, at least in the conventional world. Then metaphysically, I would be actually responsible, and that's why I'm making this videos, by the way, but that's also a bit of another story. In any case, you know what that thing was about. As I formulated before, essentially the evangelizers, let's call it this way, of what would become essentially Germany, like as the Teutonic Eastern Frankish kingdom. So this very difficultly patched together some of provincial realities that did not even clearly understand themselves as a whole, right? As especially neatly separated from, for example, the Norse, and we'll likely talk more about this as well. But there were lots of sort of blended and sort of frontier contexts that would be interesting to analyze. For example, the ones with the Slavs, etc. was to be, in fact, framed within the Catholic Empire itself. And as such, you had to spread this cohesive ideology that it was inherently anti-pagan, right? If understood literally with the etymological meaning of paganism, because any countercultural attitude really came from those darker forces of the underworld rather than any Apollonian hero brandishing the sword and defeating, not succeeding, in fact, to defeat, but being actually defeated by the Carolingians, the Franks, that had been mastering an unprecedented level of imperium, thanks also to their religious information that weren't actually that much different from the old Saxons in many ways. Old Saxons that, as we were pointing out before, would actually become one of the single greatest success of Romanization and Christianization, given their military background, their proximity also with the pre-Christian beliefs as well. And that, however, had to, in fact, be convinced of the notion that the extension, it wasn't even just about, in fact, this any excessive problem in the religious congruences of these messages, that the same Heliand proves, but the acceptation, of course, that they had been basically conquered by other people. And that, even though we're talking high medieval realities where it's not like you basically engineer things like in a nation state, these are basically aristocracies are remaining to rule in this decentralized frontier, by the way, and gradually sort of blending with the also with the conquerors in a sort of power sharing, and actually greatly increasing their own condition politically and socially compared to the rest of the people. Had to, again, go through all these changes that, as you know, brought even to the Stellinga revolt. As you know, East Francia was very scarcely stratified, right? Because simply was poor, was more primitive than the other Carolingian kingdoms. So the main problem was that the elite was too weak at a point to even withstand like the possible rebellion of the lower strata, with literally the lowest sort of batch of freemen siding with the serfs/slaves, which was something ridiculous also in a traditional perspective, in order not to end under like an ever more powerful elite that, since really the migration era, by the way, already lorded over the common people in this world, right? It's done in absolutely imagine that, I don't know, old Saxony was a place where, everybody was free, or the elite was not already in control of the system. But of course, the Carolingian Empire had a pretty hefty and also probably multiple extra gears in this context, and everything was to be properly crammed on these peoples that, as you know, fought for decades before being finally subjugated, but also, lived on to become that extraordinary success of the aforementioned conquest, right? And one of the greatest examples, in fact, in cultural achievement, right, in the history of medieval Europe and beyond, arguably, that there is something deeply metaphysical about this, that in fact, reading texts like the Heliand can help, right? I presume that you are actually, you're actually familiar with this work about the Savior. Also made a video about the Germanic Imperial Catholic miracle that very much highlights what was going on among these populations. But basically, these texts were aiming at presenting, to make the long story short, Jesus Christ as a comitatus leader, with the apostles literally being his military retinue. So basically pick Tacitus De Origine Situ Germanorum and cram it on the New Testament, on the Gospels, and have Jesus literally being the Germanic leader with his thugs, and St. Peter cutting the ear to the guard, and the blood spilling becoming a moment of greater excitation because of the famous sacrifice of the blood that was still carried out also among the Norse and these other kins, and that actually was really normal in the Catholic tradition. I mean, Gregory the Great laments that the Christian Merovingians at the beginning of the 7th century still practiced human sacrifice. Again, it's perfectly normal. We don't have to imagine human sacrifice as, I don't know, people being eaten alive or something like that, but rather, of course, the sacrifice of the prisoners, of the spolia opima, etc., something that the Saint Romans had been doing before, and it was part of the Catholic tradition. That, however, given the different level of sort of, it's not even about strict modernization or secularization, but let's say the emphasis that Christianity had placed on not just the obedience to authority, but the sense that this was in fact to be informed by actual military prowess, and so living by the same Catholic principle of power that the same peoples in fact identify themselves on. Otherwise this equation between Christ and the Comitatus leader could have never been made. Christianity has nothing to do with pacifism, thanks to God for that. Emphasize a more spiritual approach, right? Something that would not actually deny the worldly experience, but as we explained in the video about the doctrine of the two natures, mostly emphasize the importance of the higher perennial one, and sort of, in fact, make the earthly experience wholly functional to the latter, which is the same reason, with the objective of inverting the fall, and the same reason why, in fact, this earth of ours just exists, like our own fault, the fact that we broke the celestial vault because our own fear of mortality, that is the only reason why we're mortal in the first place. And so all what the great Catholic tradition is based on. And that these peoples understood pretty darn well, right? And in exactly in that message, we will see now further how this was really done. But it's just like Buddhism to an extent. It's towards the Vedas. That Siddhartha Gautama was literally a part of the case of the warriors, etc. It's the idea, look, we focus too much on the earthly achievement. In order to come back to also the earthly achievement, in this coming back to the one, we have rewired to the one. Otherwise, we're done for. And again, I made lots of videos on this topic. There is an entire playlist about Christianity. If you're interested in these topics, I urge you to go watch those things. Also, the new playlist that I made about the Imperial Catholic tradition that explains this even better from an Indo-European, also pre-Christian and non-Christian at some point perspective. I don't need to add more than much. Of course, in this video, as always, I have to realize you may be watching this for the first, in my own content for the first time ever, so I must provide at least a minimum of conventional references for you to accept that what I'm saying is actually very well grounded, by the way, in history of religions, if you are actually an expert in tradition in particular. What we actually look at today, this was the little premise to this. Welcome to Schwerpunkt, by the way. If you're not aware of the path of the Heliand was neither the only viable option nor one that enjoyed universal acceptance. So today we will admittedly look at the anomaly. So what could make you think that Christianity was more, classic towards any other, towards the very tradition that, in the sense we're explaining, like was basically just continued and would continue, in fact, in the Eastern Frankish kingdom. I don't even want to address the military aspects of this, because we often talk about warfare, strictly speaking, and how much medieval Germany actually retained that mix of, like, in a very central position, even compared to the steppes, for example. Also as maintaining for a very long time echoes of the migration era in symbological practice on the battlefields. The Dracos disappear in the 13th century. From the battlefield. So it's, just for telling you what we're talking about. I made some videos about the Teutonic warfare that really show you what this really was. They fully, at that point, embraced Catholic tradition that, if anything, the old Saxons would have upheld, but were sort of becoming counters of in front of the greater might that eventually subjugated them in that Catholic sense. That were the Franks. So ubi major minor cessat, if you know what this means. And that's, you have the theological, metaphysical, and doctrinal principle for the affirmation of the imperium / Holy Ghost / victory / naked, so on and so on. So there is, so the Heliand, we could briefly represent it. It was composed in the early 9th century, likely under the patronage of Louis the Pious, and it essentially adapted, as we explained, the gospel narrative into an old Saxon epic, so a typical Germanic epos, right? Also of the kind that would increasingly be written down, and also more generally speaking, popularized in later, like in the 12th and the 13th century. In particular, think about the Nibelungenlied. There's also the Arthurian cycle. We talked about Erech and Aeneid recently. We'll deal with all that stuff at some point in fair depth, also from a literary point of view. This was done even at a metrical level, employing, for example, a literative verse to resonate with Germanic warrior culture, because all this stuff was sung, right, in a largely illiterate society. You know that the same warrior was to be a bit of bard of some sort, and this would live on, for example, in medieval Germany to the Minnesänger, and it was all one with the notion of activity, of let's say the virile being, right, being a warrior, spilling blood on the battlefield, spilling seed in the heavenly maiden, generating other offspring, and composing here through your vision, that, as you know, is the same from Latin video, has actually the same etymology in Indo-European, to wise from visos, that literally meant the seer, right? A great attribute, especially of the chieftain, of the property of the leader of men, right? Like Christ in the narrative as, again, Tacitus, leader of the comitatus, right? And it, in fact, we know corresponds also to the biological side of the story, because the peak of male creativity is also the peak of male crime. And of course, in a society like today, where crime is, to an extent, like also the most extreme level of violence that would otherwise be disciplined, in fact, in a more sensibly Catholic direction. The Minnesänger would be, where people are habituated to chop to pieces human beings on a regular basis, but also that compose some of the single most beautiful and poetically sensitive verses in the history of mankind. And so the sheer beauty of this is perfectly encapsulates the supremacy of Catholic right toward domination and to divine transfiguration. Today, as I was saying, we will talk about the exception to this, because the Heliand is conciliatory, or is basically telling these Saxons, look, we are here. This is not just valid for the Saxons, by the way. There were lots of other peoples around looking at this. There were other peoples encompassed eventually into East Francia that had been brought under by the Franks from previous times, like the Alemanni, the Bavarians, to different degrees. We mentioned the Frisians before. The same Franks had the same identical stuff. After all, Germanic was still spoken in 10th century Neustria, for that matter, at court at least, mostly. And, the population was Romance at large, and they spoke both at court as well, in fact. But the elite was coming from the same root, so they knew each other pretty darn well. Roughly 40 years, the Heliand. So actually in a darker moment, if you think about it, this is very important contextually speaking, because you can't just simply list these works and compare them on a strictly literary basis. You must understand the time. This is the time of the great wars between the children of Louis the Pious. All right, before there is a great unitary system where you can hope more or less to more comprehensively manage the same empire in a unitary way. Now the system is fracturing. And this is actually the same years of the Stellinger Revolt, for that matter. And there are lots of interesting intersections. In fact, we will surely talk about that in a distinct video, because it's a very, very, very important event for Germanistic to explain to us how these societies actually worked, so especially comparatively to others as well. But you have Otfred, a monk schooled under the renowned scholar Rabanus Maurus at Fulda, that, as you know, was one of the most vibrant, beating hearts of Eastern Frankish culture, and actually one of the most powerful monasteries I talked about this also in other videos. And Otfred that crafted the Evangelian book in the southern Franconian Rhenish dialect, by the way, at the Weissenberg Abbey in Bavaria, right? Dedicating it, by the way, among the others, to Louis the German, the current ruler of East Francia. We are between 843 and 876. I also made a couple of videos about Louis the German's reign. It's a very important one. Now, there is a marked difference with the Heliand, right? Because the author of the Heliand, as we've seen in the relative video, was very, very familiar, not just with the pre-Christian, let's say pre-Frankish conquest mood of these peoples, but specifically with Saxon, right? It was written in Saxon, as a matter of fact. So in that specific provincial context, by a person who had this conciliatory approach in a broader moment of expansion after the terrible wars that had left, also, by the way, Saxony scarred, lots of people massacred, deported, but still, again, having effect to roll up their sleeves now and, restarting a life once again under the new regime. Right. Otfred is different. We don't know actually much about his background, but the fact that he was connected with, as you see here, the most advanced parts of Eastern Francia and the most Frankish, right, the ones that had been colonized the most, right, since the colonized and civilized since the Merovingian times, and largely also by the fact that they had been Roman back in the day, Romanized. They had the largest settlements, were the more developed, the richest in general, is quite telling. Why? Because as we will see now, the Evangelian book take instead a sort of harsh stand against the pre-Christian tradition, right? So Frankish, Franconian Rhenish dialect. These are literally, again, like the lands of the Franks, where the grandeur of the imperial legacy was left within the Eastern Frankish kingdom. This will be actually very important for the same Ottonians later, because, as you know, their power base was, provincially speaking, like Saxony plus Franconia, because you united this hardcore, primitive, brutal Saxon background, very useful militarily and imperially wise, with in fact equally from an imperial point of view, but also with much more economical resources, with the grandeur of Franconia. So the land of the Franks in the eastern in Eastern Francia. We recently talked about the Rhenish archbishoprics, so stemming literally from these cities that had been the cornerstone, by the way, of the same evangelization of East Francia, the richest, the best interconnected, the more urbanized, so to say, and therefore that brought with them, say, when heard by a Saxon, that sort of, sense of superiority of the conquerors over the more, the humbler, more primitive, say, Saxon world, right? So Weissenberg, Bavaria was also a land of very old Catholic tradition. It had even spread that from with the Princess Theodolinda to the Longobards in Italy in the early 7th century, Gregory the Great that we mentioned before. So all lands, by the way, that were deeply interconnected with the Frankish, the Merovingian and Carolingian world from quite a long time, right? So again, this is not a spoiler, as I just said. We're looking now at sort of an exception, right? The Heliand path prevailed, right? Which also ensured actually East Francia not to go back. You could think this is terrible Carolingians that had conquered and destroyed and subjugated, etc. These peoples that had this deeply ingrained sense of freedom, whatever, like after the Carolingian Empire, after a couple of generations, they would have reverted to before, right? Completely wrong. This is the greatest misconception that you've been fed with, the notion that there is no Catholic backbone to this, and that fundamentally was just a war of religion, cramming Christianity on paganism. No, right? And they would have, if that had been, this is a completely contemporary way of thinking. It was completely unknown to the people at that time. Even when they were literally taking down the Irminsul, when they were properly attacking the right of these peoples to freedom as they saw it themselves. It was just by substituting a stronger power to by subsuming the other one, because had this happened peacefully, it would have not even probably been a need to destruction. Of course, the Saxons took their stand; they were defeated fair and square, and we all know how it went. I mean, the same Widukind was not an undefeated leader who died on the sword, because no, he actually even accepted baptism and went on into the Carolingian establishment. So think about it, because the Ottonians, by the way, descended also from him, which was a sort of source of embarrassment via female line, because they didn't even properly recognize who was the obscure Frankish count, whose name, in fact, is not even known. Just imagine this guy being head on the far northeastern frontier in Saxony. Good luck with that. And that, however, would eventually give rise to what would be called, in fact, the Ludolfing dynasty, eventually the Ottonians. Now, this Otfred, as you understand, was possibly, again, we don't know too much, but he may have had multiple reasons to think negatively of the pre-Christian tradition at large. In any of its traditional forms, meaning what? That his aim was to counter what he literally deemed as the, quote, obscene lay songs, literally termed as rerum sonus inutilium, which means the sound of useless things, which, in fact, the same Otfred viewed as morally and spiritually detrimental. Right? This is extremely fascinating because he basically attacks. First of all, he makes an interesting distinction between lay and ecclesiastical. Right? In the West, there wasn't quite the same, for example, division you would find in the Byzantine world. In the Byzantine world, there was a much stricter understanding that what was properly understood as Roman, so as we would say Byzantine, was ecclesiastical in nature. Music, for example. Naturally, the Byzantine world, yes, they had oral traditions, etc., but this is exactly like the lay music and songs, etc., were not considered part of their culture. Right, the only culture was expressed by the divine perfection of the great imperial and ecclesiastical tradition of Constantinople, the Roman Empire, etc. Right, so in the West we didn't do this stuff, but there was a difference of this kind. At least there was always a separation of certain levels, right? And so these lay songs, which were the great chunks, the carmine, as Tacitus would have said, that these warriors, like also chanted before battle in the forest, in this calling for imperial, like the Holy Ghost to descend on them, etc., together with the fury of, as it would have been called in Latin, but it actually was something much deeper. I made lots of videos about the beast warriors and their theology. Were considered essentially a negative aspect. Now, unfortunately, we do not know too much about what these quote-unquote obscene but mostly like lay songs actually were, right? So we understand it better from the Heliand. It was literally mimicking them. And of course, these were chants of heroes, etc. And in this sense, Otfred was likely attacking the attachment that these peoples obviously had to the stories that surely, I don't know, also Charlemagne, how, for example, where was the Nibelungenlied in all this? We know he was alive, right? It was written down later on. It were pretty universal stories being sung, chanted, etc. At the courts, reinvigorating, respiriting, exciting the fantasies of the warriors, and so on. Think about the Song of Roland as well. I mean, it's all something that pertained to that world, really, just like in the Byzantine one. Something extremely similar to, I don't know, an Iliad set of values existed beyond, in fact, the face of Christian stuff. Just like, I don't know, when you look at the Kievan Rus, it's all icons based on the Orthodox tradition. But when you look at the archaeology, it's Western, it's Slavic, it's Turkic stuff. So, especially talking about arms and armor. So, a very interesting point should be made for these people. So, after all, are just emerging at this point from history. Up to this point, we're literally talking prehistory, and we're lucky enough, And this is unique for the Germans in history, that we have this specific point in time in which the observers were civilized enough to have a complex enough ethnography, literary development to actually depict these peoples in their stage of development, right? At this level of developmental stage. Like, we don't have this, for example, for the Romans, for example. Like, we can grasp it from more distant evidence. Here we have the utmost privilege of having that being documented from the external. Together with these complaints, right? The song of useless things, right? Why are they useless? Because, as I was saying before, in a sort of more fundamental, integral Christian sense, bothering oneself with the songs of these guys, that, by the way, presumably were still by this point pre-Carolingian, right, heroes of some sort, was seen as irrelevant. First of all, because the Carolingians had taken them over. Together, they had been Christianized in the process. So it's also obvious that an Otfred, that also is likely coming from the same East Francia, and one of these lenders that we described, by the way, so that knew these people from quite a while, were just their neighbors. It wasn't an abyss of difference between them, absolutely. Even before they were officially Christianized, were basically the same peoples, almost, in levels of development, etc. Were to be seen as lesser, right? There can be literally also this social posh kind of attitude, like, I don't know, if I'm a Rhenish or I'm a Bavarian, like, I'm not seeing a Saxon or a Thuringian as a civilized person, all right? But indeed, there is a deeper Christian philosophy to that, which at least is, generally speaking, pertinent and even correct at some of these levels. It goes deeper, because Otfred began by rejecting the alliterative verse cherished in the Germanic epic traditions, probably a hallmark of their oral poetry, as you know, which is in many ways, we can't say all they had, but largely their tradition consisted of that oral knowledge. And so if you hit that, if you discredited that, here evidently it's not like it was banned, right? It was never actually banned, right? But the church looked upon it with contempt and this sort of poorly veiled aggressiveness, even, because they realized that there was something political to it as well, right? And with that, considering that the clergy mostly stuck to the side of the actual elite, and to that at this point were actually local elite, all right? So not simply Carolingians, even if there was, I don't know, a Louis the German here, but still, again, the establishment was fundamentally from these countries. Like some sort of, well, we keep chanting about these heroes because deep inside we would like to sabotage this whole system and bring you down, and coming back to this pre-Christian reality, all right? And we must imagine that this was a great problem. In fact, the Stellinger revolt that we pointed out before, in part, was largely about this. I mean, paradoxically, those who really chanted these so-called lay songs would have probably been more the freemen, at least with that specific political message. Then it's a bit like, I don't know, think about the Protestant. It's very far-fetched, but in some ways it pointing at the elite and wanted to disintegrate in moment of upheaval, etc., mostly stemming from that basis, which is at the end of the day some sort of also, as we've seen, tendentially Gnosticistic one, and it really draws from the same alienation, in fact, from the concept that works are functional, that you should bail out of things entirely, like as if God took care of this, where there was some kind of alter force that you have to abandon, denying essentially, in fact, the imperial value of power, and so the fact that this exists only by God's grace. So the more you go on, even if you look at the Arian tradition against the Catholic one in the migration era, you realize that this countercultural element was actually creeping into this songs that likely were in fact marked by that sense of elite or not, right? So some chance, this is typical in Germanistics also, that there was some more aristocratic sense of oneself even in the, for example, in the ethnogenesis myths of these peoples, like there are, I don't know, the gods were much more about their own establishment. Once also a bit of that story had been made up for them. Other peoples that were less stratified had more like a people foundational myth. They didn't really look at kings or noblemen, but at the race, say at least of the freemen as a whole. So they all believed actually in the same thing, but they did, as you understand that in this hierarchical body, it's in this body hierarchically ordained. We just made a video the other day speaking of the Concordia Ordinum, also in looking a bit at the traditional meaning of the patriciate in a metaphysical sense that applies to these peoples as well. There are differences, there are divides. The nobility had finally made it under the Carolingians to secure a level of power that was really unknown before that system kicked in. The vassalitic beneficiary one would essentially evolve into feudalism. And so Stellinger proved how the freemen would not go down without a fight, but they also one that would lose for that matter. So given that these are the same years when Otfred is saying these things, I think it's very interesting, and it's also all the more relatable and understandable to appreciate his words, because otherwise you see, this is just the bad guy that we have to blame because he was gone against our European tradition. No, it may even be the opposite to an extent, without, however, hiding that surely there was something here specifically, because of course also the author of the Heliand was a cleric, right? It was also kind of obvious, but there were also different visions within the same church. Otfred rejected the alliterative verse, opting instead for the paired iambic dimeter. That is, as you know, a typical metrical form of the Latin Christian hymnists derived from the Ambrosian and Prudential, therefore late antique models. So something much more, let's say monumental and connected to a particular type of culture, evidently embraced also by the same Eastern Franks as Otfred was. We must also obviously point out that the Evangelian book are in Old Franconian. So as name goes, it's vernacular here that we're talking about. It's not like they wrote this in Latin. So we're talking here a level of conflict and antagonism that still happens. This is typical north of the Alps for medieval literature, that Old French, Old German become much earlier than, for example, Italian literary languages. Right, in Mediterranean, specifically in a country like Italy, Latin remained, of course, like the literary language for longer because most people knew how to use it, right, and it was already that well mastered. Whereas in Central Europe, it was much more immediate to put vernacular into written form because no other language had really. Really spread within the masses. Of course, like, as you know, in Eastern France, Latin was the official language of most Western powers. I mean, of Western powers in general, because of the church and not only. But, of course, a book like the Evangelian one is, of course, part of a missionary work. So the notion is that this had to be spread, not in Latin, because what the hell did, I don't know, a Thuringian know about Latin on average, right? Unless he was, again, a clergyman. He would not even understand that. This had to be in Old, and this is cases, Old Franconian. So, again, Thuringian, Franconian are also pretty close. Actually, for the sake of example, I made a video about both, by the way, for the original series, so you can follow also this beautiful region's history across the entire path before and after the period we're discussing. Otfred embraces the vernacular to reach his audience, but engages with epic poetry in a confrontational rather than collaborative manner. His poetic rendering of the Gospels yields nothing to his people's ancient customs beyond the use of their language. It serves as a stark counterpoint to the conciliatory approach of the Heliand's author who wove Christian teachings into the fabric of Germanic heroic ideals. Otfred's work does not appeal to the Germanic soul through the traditional language of magical formulas, often tied to pre-Christian rituals, but seeks to reshape it along with its cultural sensibilities and auditory preferences to align with the disciplined ethos of monastic life. Remember, this was revolving around Fulda, by the way, that was to become one of the major landlords in Germany, and choral worship, emphasizing the structured harmony of ecclesiastical liturgy. Consider even the clergy here. Like, some of these people would have become clergymen literally from also relatively poor backgrounds, right? So these are the same people who literally knew about those songs from the previous generations, from their ancestors, right? So this was not aimed just as a simple missionary effort, which was yet to continue across Central and from there also Northern Europe, but also, as we were saying before, with a political inclination and a sense that the same clergy had to be disciplined, had to be framed properly in a completely different order of things, as much as this institution was. And so there could not be much of a syncresis in Otfred's view. Things had probably to be enforced the right way. And this is all the more relevant if you consider about the Carolingian, for example, ecclesiastical reforms. We talked about Benedict of Aniane, known as the second Saint Benedict. The Carolingian script reform that we still use, right, from the Roman to the Carolingian tradition. In places like even the aforementioned Rhineland, Franconia, or Bavaria, that up to, in fact, Charlemagne were of course literate, were, as we've seen, civilized by the Franco-Roman tradition, but weren't particularly performing, in a strictly literary sense. In that sense, also theological purity, as what we were saying before regarding even certain paganistic survival. We were literally told by the sources were certain Bavarian. Now we're talking about Otfred, say at least where he ended up, like in Weissenburg. The priests who literally read the Bible in Latin and they did not understand what Latin meant. And so they said something that had no sense, but since they didn't even know that, they weren't trying to create a heresy out of it. And so it was not even important up to a certain point. When Charlemagne enacts his ecclesiastical reform that is aimed, of course, at supporting his great universal imperial Catholic purpose, of course, there is a sense that the clergy must be uniformed, very well disciplined in a hierarchical order. There's a massive input that arrives from Rome, from the Italic kingdom, in terms of that, literary, cultural legacy to inform things along a much more subtle pattern, and to a degree successfully, because that's also the greatest legacy of the Carolingian Empire. In many ways, at least in strictly, practical administrative terms, and one, in fact, that we still live in the wake of, and that therefore may have contributed to Otfred's sense that it was useless to concede these previous practices any room. Right here, we hear Otfred not being happy of probably even the content of this useless sounds, right? But there is a bigger picture. Like, he would have never simply distinguished the two things, right? And traditionally, that is correct. Like the form equates to the substance, even though the form precedes the substance too. And so maybe theologically speaking, so Otfred may have actually been well aware of this, that even in this missionary work, the ecclesiastical language had, even in vernacular, had to conform at least to a specific Catholic mold that was not to concede to the local particularism. clearly, in the 9th century world, whether in regions undergoing Christianization, actively spreading Christianity, or recently converted, there was space for both endeavors, that of the Heliand as much as the evangelian's book. The Carolingian Empire under Charlemagne and his successors fostered a cultural renaissance that encouraged also different approaches to evangelization. Things could not literally be standardized anyway, not even by really wanting it. Balancing, of course, accommodation with reform, right? Certain areas of Europe did not really need more than much. On the contrary, were the ones from which the Franks were growing, as we've seen. But in others, it was different. And again, for reasons that are not merely dispositive, they have to do properly with the political situation in loco. Yet, when juxtaposed with other contemporary works, it appears that the Heliand's approach was in truth the more straightforward, productive, and coherent path to pursue, as it leveraged familiar cultural forms to ease the transition to Christian doctrine. Why? Because of what we said at the beginning. Because what the, say, Old Saxon believed in the Heliand case was the same Catholic tradition, just at a scale that the political and social structure of Old Saxon community was not habituated to it or willing to accept in the moment in which they were literally taken over, in fact, by a greater power. And so as long as they could, they resisted, but not because their actual belief was different at the core from the point of Christianity. Rather than, you can argue Christianity itself. And again, I made multiple videos, especially on there's one about the paradigm shift in late antiquity as far as religion was concerned, so that explains it, because it's one of the most, it's one of the most important aspects and why Christianity came about. It's not like it was the game changer, as if the world could continue with what was happening before, that people still convinced that there was so-called paganism or polytheism or whatever they've been also crammed to from school, etc. But actually a consequence of what that previous Christian beliefs had gone into, and the quality of people had gone into, and in fact not a positive thing in that sense. And Christianity was emerging by actually acknowledging this and trying to fix it, right? Departing from Otfred, we have something more conciliatory. For instance, the Muspilli, a poem possibly contemporary with the Heliand, which describes the world's end in alliterative verse and the Bavarian dialect. This is also very interesting because, again, Bavaria was not like a newly conquered place. Again, this is normal literature that would have circulated in this, again, ecclesiastical, unequivocally Christian literature, right? The inspiration of the Muspilli is unmistakably apocalyptic, rooted in Christian eschatology, and definitely as unequivocally Christian in its theological outlook, as we just said. Nevertheless, when we get to eschatology, also to make the same point that these guys really believe the same identical religion, regardless even of the Christian element, because also the Catholic belief, remember that tradition is more important than let's say that it predates Christianity. So there is a tradition that brings necessarily Christianity into validity, but it's not like, in fact, Christianity could have simply existed in a vacuum in that way, because it comes, as we were saying before, at a certain point in the world for a specific reason, and it's included in a broader tradition. In fact, the Muspilli exhibits clear ties to the themes of the Eddic Voluspa, the Norse poem recounting a seeress's vision of cosmic creation and destruction. Right, so to Germanic pre-Christian eschatology, envisioning a universal conflagration, such as the Ragnarok of Norse mythology, the twilight of the gods, the storming of the Asgard, the age of the wolf, creeping in, right, all around, right? This theme is quite relevant for a number of reasons. Again, historical, chronological context, because we are in the late 9th century here, right? The Muspilli depicts the clash between the prophet Elijah and the Antichrist, further evoking the archetypal struggle of Thor against the Midgard serpent. So a Drakenkampf, this dragon slaying motive. I also made multiple videos about this connected to the military saints. This is very well ingrained, as you know, also in Indo-Europeistics, and I made also videos specifically about the creation of what would become St. George's iconography. That it's something that in Europe we started documenting archaeologically from the 3rd century BC. But the Muspilli has in this depiction, which, as you know, is considered, like also in Indo-Europeistics, as psychomachia, or it's mostly a metaphor. The notion is that you have to destroy your own inner demons and essentially transfigure the same monster in your own divinized soul, bringing you to heaven, like achieving that perennial life, right? And so you have actually different aspects of the Muspilli mirroring, for example, the myths of Beowulf, who battles Grendel and a dragon, and Siegfried, famed for slaying the dragon, Fafnir in the Volsunga saga. Obviously, all these stories circulated from quite a while. If you really want to select them out as a part of a broader Germano-Norse cultural background, just know that yes, it's within this regional pool, but it's part of the great Indo-European Catholic tradition since millennia, and so it's something that also the same Christianity in its as a universal meaning had God, and in part even from other sources, but again stemming from the same universal tradition. In the Muspilli, the apocalyptic tone combined with a strong prudentian influence, so you have, interestingly enough, like influence from what you could find in Norse sagas to literally late antique Latin literature, right, draws on the works of, in fact, the 4th century Christian poet Prudentius' Psychomachia, of which you have also beautiful illuminations from Carolingian manuscripts that we often use to picture, in fact, Carolingian warriors. So quite graphically showing actually, these cutting enemies to pieces, but being a metaphorical, like a metaphysical, in fact, doctrine of the two natures, something that does not belong to this world, but that is connected to our soul, the only capable of ourselves in capable of transfiguring the world entire at its maximum, and allegorize the battle between virtues and vices. It's the same thing, and it does not clash, in fact, with these pre-Christian ethos at all, right? Because also the same Christian Prudentius had been influenced through Latin culture by the Indo-European essence of the same. And we explain the actual Roman religion, again, not what the average person thinks is the paganistic copy of polytheistic Greek statues, because literally that's what you've been told in school, and I'm sorry for you. Far from tainting Christian truths, these pre-Christian reminiscences serve to bolster them by presenting Christian salvation as the fulfillment of earlier beliefs. And so, of course, the notion of a savior, that this, you could argue it's a messianic point, but it's still part of this is of the particular nature of Christianity, right? The paradox of Christianity, the fact that there is yet to be an actual battle in the end, and that also actually all these peoples would have had a hero figure that would have basically resurrected in the end time to lead the greater struggle. Everybody actually believed that, right? Here it was about convincing that Christ, that Jesus was Christ, properly meant the Lord, in in as much as the principles and so also the achievements in real life, so not merely in a metaphorical sense, were concerned in comparison also to these other heroes. And that's why Otfred was critical of those figures. You understand where this came from, right, practically, because you're not going to find this in a history of literature or a history of anthropology book, okay, even a history of religion. I'm making this because I specifically have a fair formation in the history of, say, military history and in religious history at the same time, and I can make this parallelism. I honestly myself haven't found this literally written anywhere else, but I think that what I'm saying makes sense, doesn't it? It's not, again, as I said at the beginning, like I haven't discussed this long enough, right? So this is the point. Rather than being dismissed or disproved, pre-Christian mythology is depleted and fulfilled, demonstrating not its falsity, but its elements of actual truth within the Christian world, a process of typological integration where pre-Christian motives prefigure Christian revelation as well, but in many ways, that's the other narrative, but actually overlap, right? It's so weird. I will have to discuss this. If any of you can put me in contact with Jordan Peterson to actually teach him what actual Catholic tradition is, instead of making the same idiotic talking points that you make in the Anglosphere regarding paganism versus Christianity, you actually teach actual history of religions, right? We can't make this channel boom and secure my presence around telling all this stuff and informing the world on this basis. Please make me this favor. At some point, I will move myself. Now, towards the same end, it's a bit later, the end proper of the same 9th century, in the abbeys of St. Gall or Reichenau, the other great beating hearts of Eastern Frankish culture, but probably that sense of Teutonic identity in a national sense would have been forged through ecclesiastical works that eventually through the elite spread to form that political awareness that this cluster again of provincial stem duchies would become an actual country, an actual wall, right, understood as such. And there were also centers, in fact, of Carolingian learning and manuscript production that could spread these ideas. The distic meter reintroduced by Otfred was employed for a hymn to St. George, of course, slaying the dragon. This hymn stood alone as a potent invocation of the aid of the great Christian martyr, military martyr, against emerging threats, such as the escalating raids by external invaders. That's where the context is fitting. Who were now the enemies to slaughter? It wasn't about like the same insiders here, right? Because the same East Francia was becoming prey of the Norse, the Magyars, even the Saracens. So what better chance was there for these culture builders to emphasize, in fact, that Catholic duty to unity against these eroders of civilization, right? I extensively discussed the age of the second invasions. I have a pretty hefty 10th century playlist. It's one of my favorite topics from university, because otherwise I would not really fully gotten its radical importance. And we've seen that in many places, including East Francia, these external raids, paradoxically, even though actually triggered by the same Carolingians or post-Carolingians, right? Because if this crisis had not happened, these peoples would have not invaded, right? It was not an act of volition that brought the Vikings to plunder, Gaul, Britain, etc. Of course, Britain, was not part of the Carolingian Empire, but I mean, there is a broader, still revolving around that. Just think about Alcuin and those pan-European contexts was collapsing because banally the same Eastern and Western Franks were throwing Vikings at one another, right? So it wasn't much the fact that any of these peoples made such radical impact in these lands. At most, they got some margins of it. but at most they were expelled as soon as political recompaction happened in post-Carolingian kingdoms, so very far from some kind of negativistic abyss in which everything was weak and poor and people were simply scared and closed inside their fortified centers. That's not how it happened, right? And many of these locals participated in the same invasions in the sense they allowed these guys to go against this or that neighbor or also literally hired them, as we've seen in different videos also about mercenarism in medieval Europe, right? But of course, in the moment in which these were lesser people that were coming to threaten the constituted order, it was incredibly important to foster a sense of, even of nationality, as we've seen in the Teutonic case, by reinforcing the Catholic superimposition of the Christian and pre-Christian beliefs of the Eastern Frankish kingdom. I mean, St. George was such a universal symbol. Even the Vikings themselves had the hero of the Vendel era is a horseman, right, that measures the world with that kind of guidance of the Holy Ghost. It's clear in the archaeology, the iconography of the time. So again, they all believe the same identical thing, right? It's not like also the idea of Romanity had not spread the Catholic ideal far and wide, all across and beyond the boundaries of the saint, that among peoples that still revolved around the empire and were de facto also partly Romanized in the process, regardless of the Roman occupation, where a centimeter more or centimeter less across the so-called limes that also did not quite exist conceptually, in fact, in that imperial vision. The Romans, if anything, called it munimentum, which is an incredibly more powerful idea. It's literally having the force there stationed on the edge, in the sense that that force controlled what was also outside, not just inside, if we can't talk about this. But for making you understand how relevant it was, of course, that, an Eastern Frankish miles could exterminate some Norsemen come to raid, to plunder, the mouth of the river Elbe. Especially something that was literally felt as inferior, right, as part of an underdeveloped system, something that was more fractal, in fact, tendentially paganistic in that spectrum that we were talking about before. But definitely not even from that side fully devoid of a Catholic understanding. That's why, in turn, the same Eastern Franks could understand that, even though their full conquest by the Carolingians had been in some places sort of a relatively recent and even superficial event, right? It wasn't superficial, but I mean, for considering the structures of the time, it's not like the Saxony of Henry the Fowler that was literally born under the last Carolingian emperors, was such a radically different country from, the Saxony of Charlemagne, right? Now, this hymn that we were talking about was composed in a style reminiscent of, is this hymn to St. George, of Latin hagiographic poetry. The hymn invoked St. George, a megalomartyr to say the least, venerated for his, in fact, martyrdom, which, as you know, means witness, meaning that he had literally seen God, right, in the moment of his death, meaning that he had successfully transfigured under the persecution of Diocletian, as a protector against both spiritual and physical dangers. Of course, in a Catholic sense, there is no need, as we were hinting at before, to even differentiate between spiritual and physical. Actually, physical would be the overall integrity, say, incorrect term to refer to the integrity of body and soul. That in order to think to split already likely doesn't make you a Catholic, but agnostic heresis, and so just basically communist, as a matter of fact. In any case, from around the same period, approximately 881, 882, we have another very important work emerging, the Ludwigslied, right? The Song of Louis, a vernacular poem in Old High German celebrating the Franks' exploit against the aforementioned Norse invaders, the Vikings. Specifically, we're talking about the victory of Louis III at the battle, we are in Western Francia, of Saucourt-en-Vimont. We are also in pretty recent times, 881, right? We're also in a pretty straightforward. We're talking places like Auchancourt in Haute-France on the Channel, right? So pretty like between Normandy and Picardy, just to make you understand that. This is very interesting because this is a Ludwigslied in in Old High German. So this was an event occurring in recently in a Carolingian Empire was basically collapsing. Like in 7 years, it wouldn't properly ever be a proper Carolingian emperor. Carolingians would keep to rule in fact exactly in West Francia, but this was, we're talking Louis III, so an episode taking place. This was the son of Louis the Stammered, was son of Charles the Bald, right? And an event taking place were essentially in a German land, so to say, Teutonic land. No, literally in Neustria, in a place where people spoke Romance. But the deed of the hero, the Carolingian hero on the Channel against the Vikings, was registered and evidently had great success, because this is also how news spread through epic poetry about very recent events up to Germany, right? So this story glorifies of course, the triumph of the Franks, because that's also how technically, like, the kingdom is called, like the one of the Eastern Franks, and it glorifies their triumph as the result of God's particular aid, the Holy Ghost, aka the Imperium, aka Victoria, framing the Frankish king, in that case Louis III, as a divinely ordained warrior in the mold of Old Testament leaders like David, right? I would like to point out that notoriously Charlemagne was nuts for David's figure, right? And of course, God as Lord of battles, and the largest bloodsheds that, of course, must be present unavoidably in the Bible to explain what's the entire point, by the way, of a Catholic empire. It's as if from these works, also chronologically scattered along the later Carolingian era, you could grasp first of all, like the homogeneity of this genre in general, regardless of the different authors and the way they emerge, whoever had written them, how. Unfortunately, we don't know all what we would like to know, but we understand that there is this Germanic epos element, that there is this biblical, of course, references and base that is fully Christian background. There is also like that level of Latin literary, geographical, and poetical, metrical information, etc., so that you can, as a litmus test, measure how they deal with issues. But what was happening around in those times? The age of Viking raids had begun, with Norse incursions intensifying along the coasts and rivers of Western Europe, while also the Saracens held sway over the Mediterranean, raiding as far as Rome and controlling key trade routes. So imagine how there is all a specific spiritual temper that I described, especially in the videos about Otto of Cluny. Again, I made lots of videos about especially the 10th century, explaining also from the late night how that now sense of, oh my God, everything is collapsing, these guys are creating issues. Like there is a darker Iron Age that is coming at this point from the more Apollonian expectations of the Carolingian universal dominion. Of course, these works tend to be to pass, it seemed, from a more strictly missionary, evangelical purpose to like one of galvanization, right, of inflammation of the warrior ethos, mixing the two, say, souls, so to say, of this essentially Franco-Roman tradition. The Magyars recently made a video about the Battle of Riade. As you know, nomadic people from the steppe would soon devastate the West as well, launching devastating raids into Central Europe. By the early 10th century, this would be the biggest problem of East Francia, right? All post-Carolingian kingdoms were hit by all three, like the major, like the Vikings, the Saracens, and the Magyars. But East Francia was hit the most by far by the latter. The Christian populace, especially those newly converted in regions like Saxony, even in parts, again, of the Bavarian hinterland, looked heavenward, right? Especially the latter were the most exposed to the Magyars from the Pannonian plain along the Danube. And so think about this, because the anticipation of the hero who would defeat the Midgard serpent, rotting the roots of the tree of the world. And so we're talking the Antichrist evil, like in the broader Catholic tradition. This dimming of the light, right? This obscuration, this shattering of the Asgard and its collapse. Its imminent collapse was out there. The sense of the enemies circling around you with fire. This was part, as you know, of the same Nibelungenlied, right? Attila, the court in Pannonia, like the court of Vienna, as the later tradition would put it. After all, the Huns follow the same path of the Avars, of the Magyars. So there was the constant reactivation of those ideas, of those stories, of those roles, because you would imagine Bavarian militants, Bavarian knights, having to literally fence off this rain of locusts that was swarming across the land, flagellating it and being seen as a divine punishment for the sins of the Catholics. That makes sense more than Christian, even, to make you understand the point, because Catholic in that universal imperial sense is literally picturing the fact that how now the empire was crumbling literally to pieces. So this is, and even more so, it's not a territorial thing, it's a matter of leadership. All right, the imperium exists not as the Byzantines tried to make it as legalistically to preserve the uniqueness, the alleged uniqueness of their Romanity, which of course was shared in the West by the Westerns as well, as a legalistic, like, territorial jurisdiction, right? The imperium has to do with leadership, has to do with the leader, he who literally guides the troops into battle and achieves the dominion. That is metaphysical, it's inconsistent. There isn't really a state or a territory or whatever. It does not make any sense, especially from a metaphysical point of view. There is a manifestation of divine power by those media that are the elected ones by God in virtue of their own merit, right? To uniting this community in that strength, and political cohesion is the first. Is the precondition for victory, and so divine transfiguration. So all this the situation would obviously have the typical hero blending Christian to eschatological expectations with the same German mythological imagery. They also both believe in the same thing, right? There was, for both, of course, a linear understanding of the world. It wasn't much of a cyclical thing. The cycles existed within a linear path. You're also being told that the terrible Christians at some point arrived and they inserted like a linear thing. It was all cyclical. No, right? The Chthonic pre-Indo-Europeans believed that. The Indo-Europeans had a linear understanding, mixed, of course, like in any tradition, with the cyclical one, but the first was prevalent. There was a beginning and an end, right? This was also understood by different degree by pretty much everybody. And just an idiot in the 21st century could categorically separate the two things in history of religion. So against in this sense, pagan Antichrist, because it was opposite to the Catholic Empire. This is paganism. The Magyars were, from their perspective, would have been a form of Catholic because they wanted to extend their power in a greater sense. But obviously, in an Eastern Frankish perspective, this was a pagan Antichrist who burned, demolished, and ravaged, embodied in the destructive race, by the way, of also the Vikings, the Saracens, and later Magyars, making the Catholic populations await for a divine hero or human champion shaped in his likeness, such as a Christian king or saint who could embody the virtues of Christ the warrior. Made a video in the very early days of Schwerpunkt regarding Gerald of Aurillac, not Gerbert of Aurillac, that is Pope Sylvester II. This is a character that likely existed, but whose biography was written by Otto of Cluny, that I was mentioning before exactly because it shows you what was the new understanding of the hero in this world. One of, as we've seen, of private elites that paradoxically had also largely contributed to the collapse of the system, but now had to literally defend their own possessions. By the way, with a population that historically had, as we've seen, lost a great deal of individual power, and that in fact looked up to warrior elite for salvation, given that in fact the Imperium has this universal capacity. That's just how Christ is supposed to have died for our sins exactly. Even if we do not say we have not really deserved this call, all right, and that we have, however, ourselves to contribute to just as much as these guys would contribute, for example, to the local knights, sort of moat reparations, like especially the fodder for the horses. It's all emerging as this model, like Gerald of Aurillac, of lay sanctity, which is very interesting when you look at what Otfred was saying. This is obscene lay songs, whereas at this point, the same layman was becoming the hero. And of course, the separation to say Otfred wasn't likely going that far in saying that what was lay was obscene or was bad. Because he fully understood that the Imperium is wielded by the myth, the warriors, and so even though warrior saints in fact already existed, in fact that would be technically the same thing, right? Sanctity is something that goes beyond the mere the belonging to the clergy, for that matter. So it's all fully coherent, really. You understand what is happening. You understand how sort of coherent, in fact, again, the path here is. How much we can understand about just knowing the highlights of that period, the second invasions, the disgregation of the empire, etc., through the content of the songs, and the temper of their time contained, in fact, in it. The era was really ready for this change, and you know that on Schwerpunkt we have been exploring, we will keep doing so, how the church from the 4th to 10th centuries had formulated her own theology of warfare, right? It wasn't really, actually this is even older. We've seen it with Justin, for example. We've seen it with really, like with Christ himself. You really read the Gospels, it's sort of evident that there is not, think about St. Paul's militia, right? Think about it, there is no such thing like a demilitarized space within the Catholic world. On the contrary, right? And on earth, you must, the fact that you're a sinner entails the fact that you must fight, right? And regardless of the metaphor regarding the doctrine of true natures, Christianity, we've seen it in many videos, was never, even once opposed to military service. The problem of the so-called military saints was not the fact that they had to shed blood in the army. Hell, they were in the army themselves, by themselves, and being very good soldiers, and normally being that. I mean, Saint Martin of Tours was in Julian's Schola Palatina. Do you understand what that means? Did they even tell you that Martin of Tours likely butchered hundreds of people in his lifetime, right? The entire problem was whether the leader was the emperor in that case, in fact, the holder of the Holy Ghost bestowed by God, was actually of that universal character, and so divine truly. And there was a refusal, because evidently in that moment of decline, where other, say, powers were emerging, the empire was fracturing. This was not evidently a proof of divinity. And so it was actually a very strong metaphysical coherence to it all. So Christianity always had its own theology of warfare. It always backed the Roman Empire. They always said, as Romans, by the way, to imperial holders, like, okay, we're fully into the empire, just be Christian. And it's perfectly okay. Like, since the 4th century, if you look at Ambrose, it's like, there is a clear green light to any army, especially, say, defensive war, but intended mostly in the preservation of what was a universal empire that had, of course, to extend to all over the globe. And again, there is no hint whatsoever, if not in heretical tradition, to the notion that Christianity had any sort of anti-military bias whatsoever. It's a religion that is aimed to achieve peace, of course. It's a bit like the Romans, what made a desert, they call it peace. And in the sense that, of course, that there had been a major pacification coming from the world leader that had to reduce the entire universe to a united power where war would have not been seen. In that sense, it's peaceful, right? You really need Christ, according to eschatology, for that, as much as actually the Germano-Norse believed that there had to be a great showdown in the end time in order to, say, stop the continuous creeping of the underworldly forces that were destroying the Asgard because of the sin of the same Aesir, by the way, that had allowed the netherworlders to build it with, so polluting the gold that had constituted the citadel, right? So, aside from, again, the particularly defensive warfare, especially like St. Augustine said a lot of that, it could have not been otherwise. It was mostly based on conviction. The idea is that, Christianly speaking, you must succeed just with arms that do not belong to this world. But not in the sense that in this world, say, you cannot achieve that level of capacity without wielding weapons in this world for real. You know, that's sometimes the misunderstanding people have, because, again, they do not literally know what the doctrine of the two natures is. I still see, figures like Jordan Peterson struggle with this elementary concept. Like, if you don't know that, what the hell do you know about history of Christianity or Catholicism? Like, literally zero, right? But unfortunately, we live in a world that has basically eliminated these concepts, even as conventional knowledge. So that's basically terrifying. But, for example, Augustine had articulated notoriously the concept of just war, the bellum justum, which was enough, just given Augustine's legacy, especially in this part of medieval history, to accept, of course, an evangelical army. Later, Carolingian theologians adopted these ideas to counter external threats as well. This had been done at the court of Charlemagne. When we read at these works, the Heliand, the Evangelian book, the Muspilli, etc., we are really looking at the Ludwigslied, literally, like in the latter, like it's a celebration of a guy, a Christian leader, killing pagan enemies. All right, what's in Germany, by the way, this happening in a Romance country, and say in East Francia, this becoming such a cool story. This is a fully Catholic understanding of the importance, by the way, of the empire. By populations who, according to some at least, according to, not some, but say undereducated people on the internet making noise, would have been this, just awaiting this terrible Frankish rulers and Christian priests to go away, right? They had all the time and chance to do so during the second invasions and to open the gates to the, as it happened in other places, like, to the Arabs in the Byzantine Levant. This did not happen. On the contrary, continental Europe struck back in a massive way, like all the post-Carolingian kingdoms got rid of all these problems that they had themselves, first of all, actually caused, right? Because without this imperial power, not even the second invaders would have had any power, right? And this is really, like, when you study this literature, you realize how it's functional, right? Precisely functional, and in perfect continuity with what early, also say late antique or medieval Christendom explicitly required to safeguard the Christian community and consolidate its faith, right? And we made lots of videos about this. We'll continue making them. The development of the same arms and armor as a reflection of this political, military, social developments. We talked about, the development of stirrup technology that wasn't a cause, but mostly a consequence of cavalry development, because of what we also profiled today in part with the main social change. We'd look at the difference in the saddle, the same social structures during the so-called Dark Ages. Particularly the feudal system's emergence under the Carolingian so-called reforms. It wasn't really a feudal one, nor were actual reforms, but the vassalitic beneficiary system definitely was heavily intensified by the Carolingians, notoriously so. So that a new kind of mounted warrior slowly took shape, right? Equipped for rapid and effective, especially shock combat, right? Like cavalry is always about, but in unprecedented ways that would take some time to develop, but still growing incredibly so. And especially in collective training, especially therefore in a wider level, of effectiveness. And so you have the medieval knight, a figure blending Christian piety with martial prowess, really being on the verge of being born, right, heralding a new era in European history. You can appreciate even from sources like the ones that we profiled today. And again, it's practically impossible to remain insensitive to this kind of push, to this kind of, look, sources are very clear, right? Nobody is trying to misread them or whatever. Like, all what they tell us is incredibly coherent with the entire system. So imagine, again, if you have never heard of this story, imagine you had to start looking into, the Heliand, Muspilli, the evangelian book, the Ludwigslied, the hymn to Saint George, etc. alone, right? If you actually had had them together, like, there is evidently a need of comparison, right? But individually, like if somebody had told you, how much would you actually think you can get from these sources? I mean, even penitentiary books are, so incredible in the kind of information they can provide us regarding even in literally warfare, that it's really a crime not to be there and getting them and wanting to look more thoroughly into them. Very well, however, for today I stop it here. We'll keep talking. Let me check how many videos we made about the evangelization of Europe before I make the final statement. Well, 36, this is the 37th. Not bad. Some were very original. Some I didn't even actually re-upload from the great flood, of 2021. But, yeah. Well, which is a pity, because some of these videos are... I could even... Frankly, if we look at the pictures, I could even release them. But anyway, we do things in order here. But I'm glad we add to the sum, so that's very important. So for today, I really stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.